David is everybody knows David. When you Google him, there's come out like a million items about him. So I don't need to introduce him more. But what I want to say is that for a long, long time ago, New York Chinese Cultural Center has been around for almost 40 years. And he is actually one of our advisory board. Oh. We're all coming home that we finally have something and something presentable, and to have David to come back to give it back to the community and to share the idea with the family in these centers. So now, without further ado, David Hwang.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I am on the advisory board, but I also feel like I haven't done that much, and so I hope to be able to do more in the future, A. And B, when I got here today, I was like, yeah, I've been in this space before, but it's really improved so much, and you've done so much with it. So, Kathy, I think you get a lot of credit for really kicking this organization up to the next level. But I think since we are at the Chinese Cultural Center, I thought I'd talk a little bit about just how my views of being Chinese American have changed over the 30-odd years that I've been a playwright. And how I think that the community as a whole is evolving in terms of our relationship, not only to being Chinese American, but also to the root culture. I mean, what is our relationship to China? And I know that my feelings have changed a lot about that over the last 30 years, and I think that it's somewhat indicative of how the community as a whole has continued to evolve and struggle with the question of our relationship to the root culture. So I grew up in the, basically I was a kid in the 60s, and at that time, there was the notion of being Chinese or anything, any kind of minority, that wasn't that encouraged in terms of embracing your sort of ethnic roots. That it was much more kind of assimilationist culture, and we were all sort of aspiring to be, if we couldn't quite be whites, we could at least be sort of honorary whites. And so I thought of my Chineseness as sort of a minor detail in my character. I mean, I knew I was Chinese, but I didn't think it had any greater significance than that. I sometimes like to say that I thought it was like having red hair, sort of an interesting, unusual feature, but nothing more significant. Except that I remember as a kid, if I knew there was going to be a TV program or a movie that featured Asian characters, I would go out of my way not to watch it. And I think that even then, I kind of intuited that, the way that Asians were being portrayed in movies and in the popular media was what I would call inhuman, which is to say, they might have been inhumanly good, like the sort of Charlie Chan character, who's probably some of you who are younger maybe don't even know who Charlie Chan is anymore, but he was a sort of popular, theoretically Chinese detective, although he was never actually played by a Chinese or Asian person. But he was so he was the good guy, but he was written sort of so badly that he did not seem human. And then there were a lot of Asian villains, whether it's sort of Fu Manchu, who was a famous evil bad guy, and then various Chinese, Korean, Japanese, or Vietnamese soldiers, depending on what country the US happened to be at war with in that particular moment. But all of these characters didn't seem to be human beings because I think they were badly written. When we talk about stereotypes, it seems to me that a stereotype is basically bad writing. It's a one- or two-dimensional Asian character. It doesn't matter if he's a computer scientist or a waiter or a gangster even, or or president of the United States. So long as the character is written like a human being, so that we are able to relate to that character, then I feel that it battles stereotypes. And so when I was a kid, it was a completely different set of stereotypes about Asians. If anything, it was that we were kind of poor and uneducated and menial laborers. And now, just 50 years later, that stereotype has completely gone in the opposite direction. So now, if anything, the stereotype is that we have too much money, too much power, and we raise the curve in math class. But neither of those are completely true. They're just different. One thing that hasn't changed is this notion of Asians being perpetual foreigners. One's ancestors might have come to this country a generation or two ago, and people still go, oh, you speak really good English. So there is this sense that Asian Americans are not quite fully American. And I don't know that that has changed in the last 50 years. So that continues to be something we have to deal with. I had no idea that I was going to end up writing about some of the kind of East-West issues or immigration that I have ended up, that have ended up becoming a big part of my career. I just wanted to be a playwright. But the summer before my senior year in college, I was home in LA, and I saw an ad in the LA Times calendar, the entertainment section, and it said, study playwriting with Sam Shepard. And some of you know Sam Shepard is sort of a wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. He's also a movie star. He was the longtime companion of the actress Jessica Lange. But this was in the late 70s, so he was only a playwright back then. And I was a big fan of Sam Shepard's work, so I clipped this ad and sent it in. And it was the first year of something that eventually became a pretty significant event in Southern California theater called the Padre Hills Playwrights Festival, which started to happen every year. But this was only the first year that they ever tried to do this thing, so there were only 2 of us that applied to be students. We both got in. And at Padre, Sam and some other great playwrights, Maria Irene Fornez and Murray Metnick, they started to teach us to write more from our unconscious. So what does that mean? Before I went there, I thought, okay, the way you write a play is you sort of structure a bunch of scenes. In other words, you go, okay, first this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this, and then you write them. And the late Nobel Prize-winning playwright Harold Pinter talks about the fact that you make a deal with your characters. Sometimes your characters do what you want, and sometimes you do what your characters want. But that means your characters have to have enough life to have their own opinions. And my characters didn't really do that. So, I was structuring these plays, and they had a structure, but they didn't seem to have any life to them. And so writing from the unconscious means trying to bypass sometimes that voice in your head that tells you what a play is supposed to be, or how you're supposed to write. And that's the same voice that often tells you, oh, you're not good enough to be doing this, why are you trying this, who cares what you're writing, who do you think you are? All of that tends to come from our conscious mind. Whereas the unconscious or subconscious means being willing to go places that you don't understand, to follow your gut, to feel some sort of impulse, and be willing to take a risk. And when I did that, I found these issues appearing on the page, things that I didn't know I was interested in, like immigration and assimilation, and what it meant to be Chinese American. So clearly, some part of me was really interested in these questions and issues, but my conscious mind hadn't figured that out yet. And it was through writing the plays that I kind of began to discover myself as a Chinese or an Asian American. And so, at that point, even the term Asian American was fairly new, and the idea of multiculturalism was new also. And a bunch of us who were Asians who were working in the arts were trying to find a kind of Asian American voice. We were trying to say, okay, we can write about these stories, and it can be a legitimate part of the American artistic and cultural scene. So at that point, I had sort of three ideas. One was that, you know, all American literature is ethnic literature, because all literature comes out of some experience and some kind of culture and some community. And whether we talk about Tennessee Williams writing about the American South, or Sam Shepard writing about the American West, these are particular cultures and communities, the same as any kind of ethnic community. And the second is that by becoming more specific, we become more universal. And that means that when you go to see a show and it's, the characters are from a culture or a family or a country that you don't know, at first the details of their lives are different, and so they might seem strange. But if the play is well written, at a certain point you start to go, oh, that guy's kind of like my Uncle Fred. And so you begin to then appreciate the kind of shared humanity that exists beneath all of the surface layer of customs and habits. And in that way, the work becomes more universal. And the third thing I felt is that, you know, we should be able to write about these subjects and have as good a career as anyone in the American theater or the American art scene or whatever. And so, you know, that remained to be seen. But we were also very concerned with identifying ourselves as Americans. And I think this came out of the fact that when you look at the late 70s, it wasn't that far after, say, the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, where most of you are probably aware that, you know, Japanese Americans were sort of rounded up and during World War II and sent to internment camps in places like Rower, Arkansas, or Tule Lake. And so this was, you know, we talk about racial profiling now, but this was a really extreme example of racial profiling and the notions that, this notion that Asians aren't real Americans, that Asians can't be trusted as Americans. And I think that we, at that point, really wanted to make it clear that we were Americans first. And as a result, a lot of us didn't, we sort of wanted to not be associated with the root culture, because we had been so much, and the thing that people weren't thinking of us as were Americans. And so that was sort of where things were back then. And then at a certain point, I started having a career. I wrote a play to be done in my dorm called FOB, which stands for Fresh Off the Boat, and I was we were, it was sort of about the conflict between ABCs, American Born Chinese, and FOBs. And I wrote it to be done in my dorm because I just wanted to see one of my plays staged. So even if it meant I had to kind of do it in my dorm in the lobby and direct it myself with kids from the dorm, that's what I did. But through a variety of fortuitous circumstances, a year later, this play opened at the Public Theater downtown here off Broadway, produced by Joseph Papp, who is arguably, maybe the greatest American theatrical producer of the last half of the 20th century. He created Shakespeare in the Park, and founder of the Public Theater, and he produced lots of things on Broadway, including A Chorus Line. And how did that happen? To a large extent because of political pressure from the community. A year before my play was produced at the Public, about the time I was doing it in my dorm, the Public Theater did a play by Len Jenkins called New Jerusalem, in which a Caucasian actor was cast in an Asian role. And this led to protests about casting, which predated the bigger controversy over the casting in Saigon by about 10 years. But the Asian actors of that day went and protested this because they felt this was an example of quote-unquote yellowface casting, sort of like blackface. We generally accept that you're not supposed to cast white actors to be African Americans and black up their faces, but yellowface to look for plays for Asian American actors. And it was just about that time that my play, FOB, came across his desk. So I always feel like I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action. Because there was a slot that was created for someone like me, and I was the one who got to take advantage of that and step through that door and have those opportunities. And so I've always felt like having a career in the first place is, to a large extent, the result of people in the community sort of speaking up and being willing to protest and being willing to stand up for what they believe and having protests. So I was produced at the Public, and then I started to have a career, and at a certain point I had a large success on Broadway called M Butterfly, which we can talk about if you want to. We can ask questions about M Butterfly. But I want to sort of jump fast forward to where we are now. And most recently with Chinglish, which was a play that I had on Broadway last season. And Chinglish is set in Hwang, in contemporary China, and it was a play about an American businessman, a white American businessman who goes to Hwang to try to get a deal for his company. But the play was about a quarter in Mandarin, and we projected the English translations of the Mandarin onto the set for people who don't speak Chinese. And that came about because I started going to China a fair amount in the last 5 or so years. Because China has become very interested in Broadway-style shows. And I happen to be the only even sort of Chinese person who's written a Broadway show. So I got called over for a lot of meetings with people to talk about projects. None of which ever amounted to anything, except that it's been giving me a chance to kind of see China and learn about the amazing changes that are taking place over there. And on the first trip over first I went in 93, but the first trip over I went for work was in 2005, and I was taken to a beautiful new cultural center in Shanghai, which was perfect. It had the Brazilian woods and the Italian marble and the Japanese sound system, and then I had these really badly translated signs, which are referred to as Chinglish. So, for instance, the handicapped restroom said deformed man's toilet. I began thinking of using these signs as a jumping off point to write a play about doing business in China today, but one that would deal with the issue of language, because I think as Americans we always duck that. There's we might see a movie or a play about an American character who goes to, say, Brazil, but then all the Brazilians speak English with a Brazilian accent. And it just doesn't reflect the experience at all. But the larger point I want to make about Chinglish is just that it's interesting to me to look at the distance between starting out and writing FOB and feeling like it's most important to identify myself as an American. And then Chinglish, which is really a play about U.S.-China relations, and it's not an Asian American play as such. I mean, it doesn't have an Asian American character. It has Chinese characters and one American character, and then there's a British character also. But and I think that over the years I've come to feel like it is interesting to recognize that we are first and foremost Americans, but I've become more and more interested in kind of connecting with China and writing about China and learning about China. I mean, I can only write about it to some extent because I'm limited in my knowledge and I don't speak the language. And yet, when I would go to China for meetings, there are different layers of misunderstanding. So I would find, okay, on the language level, I don't understand what's going on, basically, and I'm just like any other sort of stupid monolingual American, and I need a translator. But then underneath that, there's sort of another layer of things that I found that I did understand. Like, I basically know how I'm supposed to act at a business meeting, and I know how I'm supposed to sort of relate to my colleagues and what I do at a banquet. And there's just things that I'm like, oh, I know a little more than I thought that I did. And I guess this is knowledge that was passed down to me by my parents, even though they weren't necessarily trying to do so. And then probably underneath that, there's a whole other layer of stuff I don't understand also. But there is this sort of starting out, we had this, this term multiculturalism was, relatively new. Right now, multiculturalism is pretty much a part of the American discourse, and people like it or they don't like it, but it's here, and so it's not particularly daring to talk about it anymore. What I find is interesting at the moment is this term that some young people are using, transculturalism, which is this idea that you don't necessarily have to pick one or the other. You can acknowledge all the different influences that have gone into making you who you are. And there are a lot of people nowadays who, let's say among Chinese Americans, who could be perfectly comfortable living and working on a high professional level in America or in Asia. I mean, I don't happen to be one of those because I'm not really, but there are a lot of other people who are. And I feel like that is just the reality of the world getting smaller and the fact that China has become much more central to the American imagination than it was 40 or 50 years ago. When I first started doing plays, people, non-Chinese or non-Asians were interested in China, it was because maybe they had been there, or maybe they were going to work there, or maybe they thought it was exotic, but there was no sort of fundamental reason that people felt they needed to be interested in China. And now, of course, everybody is. Some people fear it, some people embrace it, but it's very much on people's minds. So China has just become so much more central to American discourse. So those are the three shows that are part of the signature season. And I think looking back, it is very heartwarming that some of us who are about my age could start writing about these subjects, about being Asian American, being Chinese American, thinking we could maybe have a career in the American theater, American art scene, whatever it is, and that many of us have been able to do that. But there's still a lot of new ground to be broken. And I think that's why places like this are so important, because it's wonderful that, people say nice things about me most of the time, or that you come out to hear me, but it's really about supporting the next generation, because me or Ang Lee or Amy Tan, we have careers now, and certainly the support from the community is very heartwarming, and it's almost like in political terms, my base. And yet the people who really need help are the people who are just coming up, who are willing to take that risk, to go into the unknown, to try to be artists as Chinese and Asian Americans. And so thank you for being here for me today, and I also encourage you to support the Chinese Cultural Center and the arts organizations within the Chinese and Asian American community, and really have the next generation of those of us who have careers now help the next generation so that there's more work, more